Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our Career Development Seminar Series, The Third Way, aimed specifically at academics on education pathway, but of course open to everyone. And so my name is Dr. Roshana Husainova. I'm from University of Bristol Business School, and it's my absolute pleasure and such an honor to present to you today's guest, Professor Helen Williams. So Professor Helen Williams is Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education and Student Experience in Social Sciences at University of Nottingham. And she's a proud member of education-focused career track, which is fantastic to know. And also one of the very first recruits in Russell Group politics departments on this education-focused track. Professor Williams is an award-winning educator, and her specialism is on teaching statistics using SPSS and research methods. And over the course of her career, she had various leadership roles across universities and beyond as well. Professor Williams, thank you so much for coming to present your career journey here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I'm just going to share the slides. That come through okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't have a huge number of slides. It's probably not a huge amount of me talking, but it's more just laying out some of the things that I've found over the years with education-focused careers. And the interesting thing that I've discovered is I originally thought this was a Russell Group problem in the UK. I thought it was something of, the identity as research-intensive universities meant that understanding what education-focused careers were, that they weren't just glorified teaching fellows that we could load as many hours per week onto as possible. I thought that was a Russell Group problem. And what I've discovered is it's very much not a Russell Group problem. So we're having these discussions at lots of different universities with lots of different identities, staff backgrounds, student backgrounds. And it seems like this is a moment of change for this career where we're starting to define ourselves and be seen not in the Higher Education and Statistics Agency T only category, but actually looking more in the round of what an education-focused career is. So just talking about what this thing is, it's called different things at different universities. So whilst R&T is a fairly common terminology at British universities, what this career is, which I've chosen to call education focused. Some places it's teaching focused, teaching and learning, teaching and scholarship, education and scholarship. At my institution, it's teaching and curriculum leadership. But basically what I'm talking about is the full career path within an academic job family. And in the Higher Education Statistics Agency, they classify you into 3 different paths. So you can be teaching only, you can be R&T, and you can be R only. But of course, that doesn't encompass or in any way represent the amount of diversity that exists on this career. So who are we? If you look at the HESA data, which I do like a good piece of data, I mean, 15 years of teaching research methods, I always go looking for the evidence. So this is just a kind of roundup overview. What do we look like? How are we different? And if you compare us to R&T core path, we're much more likely to be early career, not to hold the title of professor, to be on temporary contracts, part-time contracts, female, Black or Asian, disabled. And those are just of the personal characteristics that are collected and published by HESA. So when I was speaking to some members of staff recently, what came out is that actually we're also more likely to be people who are first generation to go to university in their families. And I very much cannot say that about my own. So to put my educational privilege out there, the only first that I can claim in my wider family is I'm the first woman to get a PhD. So there's this strong educational history in my family, but there are many people on this career track for whom that's not the case. So finding role models and looking at what that looks like is much harder. In terms of where they sit, only just over 1% of all academic staff in the UK are professors on T-only contracts. The vast majority of them are temporary, and these are people that in times gone by would be referred to sometimes dismissively as teaching fellows. And about 3/4 are part-time staff. And I think that is also an overlap with the overrepresentation of women compared to other parts of academia. So women are much more likely to go part-time after having children, for example, and then they're also more likely to be pushed onto tea-only paths, whether or not that's what they wanted, simply because the pressures of delivering research and teaching on a part-time contract are that much higher. If we look at the proportions, so nationwide, tea-only contracts are on the rise. They have grown substantially over the last decade or so. So it's pretty much doubled in population of the total number of people who are on tea-only contracts, but we still are lower than R-only, which is an interesting point in itself. And R&T is by far the most common contract. So R&T has risen a little bit over the last decade as higher education has expanded and we've brought more and more people into higher education. R has remained pretty much flat, but it's really in the tea-only careers. And I think this is where we're seeing this growth in conversations about who are we, why are we different, is that we're finally starting to get that critical mass of voice where people are discussing it. If we look at this, I know this is super complex, but the only thing that you need to take away from this is that those two patterns on the left and the right look really, really different. So R&T staff are most likely to be permanent contracts, some of them on part-time, some of them on full-time, whereas T staff are much more likely to be on temporary and part-time contracts. So it just shows the different pressures and people that are in those job families. If we look at the proportion of people who are teaching only and professors, so of R&T staff, about 20% of the national population are professors. What I do want to know is the difference in axes between these two. So on the left, the R&T axis runs to 100%, and I've had to enlarge that to a maximum of 3% in order to demonstrate the T population. So we are a very, very small percentage at the upper echelons of the career. And from people that I've spoken to, there's quite a lot of them that actually, when I spoke to them, I was quite surprised that they didn't hold the title of professor, because they certainly hold the eminence and the impact and the reputation of a professor, but they've never been given that title. And so some people have kind of hit a glass ceiling. They can be very, very esteemed and have a national or international reputation, but they're still stuck at senior lecturer or associate professor, depending on the institutional terminology. So as a proportion of all of the professors, there are few on the ground. So how does this compare with my journey, and how does this all come together? So my perspective is a bit different, and it's probably informed by the fact that I've experienced higher education systems in 4 different countries, and I had a liberal arts background for my undergraduate. So I took lots of different subjects. I ended up in a politics department. None of my degrees were in politics. They were all area studies. So I dabbled in politics, economics, history, geography, languages, whatever it was, to answer questions about the world. And it was interesting experiencing very different higher education between undergraduate and postgraduate, because I went to a liberal arts university. It technically qualified as a university. I think it awarded 2 postgraduate degrees, and the entire university population was 3,500. I think there were 6 people in my year who were studying the degree that I was. My largest lecture was 50. And then I did year abroad in Germany and Russia, and got a little bit of an experience of what it's like to be one very small fish in a very big pond. And then I went to a research-intensive university for my postgraduate studies, which again was a completely different perspective on higher education, interactions between teachers and students, and so on. And I think it's also why lecturing is not my forte. I'm great in small groups, but lecturing itself is an art form that is not my strongest point for teaching, and I think that has something to do with my background, that I experienced very little of it before postgraduate. So how I got here was in 2008, I started as a graduate teaching assistant, and I started off by teaching statistics because I received the very sage advice from another student that if I wanted to have consistent teaching, I should sign up to teach statistics because nobody wanted to do it. And then I discovered that actually I quite enjoyed teaching statistics and research methods to first year students. And so I ended up focusing on how they learn and how I could help them to engage better with statistics, trying to address some of the idiosyncrasies of the British school education system and how they were affecting students' ability to engage in the classroom. And discovered that teaching was really my niche. I could do the research, didn't get the kick out of it that I did from teaching. And then in 2013, I think I just got super lucky because University of Nottingham happens to advertise their first experiment in a full external hired career track, education focused, permanent position. There were very, very few of those. I applied for loads of other jobs, and even when it was in precisely my niche research area and part-time and 1 year, I couldn't even get those posts. So I got very lucky, and I always want to recognize that there is a lot of luck involved in progression on this career. So the next element was luck that I got what turned out to be the very final round of higher education funding for collaborative teaching grants, which was a pretty substantive grant at that point. And that was looking at assessment feedback. And it was a multi-institutional project. And up until, I got promoted to associate professor, and up until that point, I looked plausibly R&T-ish. So that promotion went fine, but it was going from associate professor to professor that I really started to run into these questions of what makes us different? What doesn't make us just R&T copy and paste? And that's where I ran into a promotion fail in 2019, where one of the core reasons I was knocked back is that I didn't have enough of an international reputation and impact. And I thought, well, what does that mean for an education-focused career? Because depending on what aspect of student learning you might specialize in, that may be completely inapplicable in other higher education contexts. If it's something about like core cognitive theory and theory of learning, of course, there are some universals, but there's a lot of things about how we teach that are actually specific to the way the UK approaches higher education, with this focus on doing things as cohorts. It's progressing through stages of your degree rather than progressing in certain areas. It's the fact that you don't continue with many subjects after the age of 16. So a lot of the context of what we do and how we do it is actually quite different. I got really frustrated by this. And then COVID hit, so I was really demoralized. Then COVID hit, and in terms of distractions and putting things in promotion, suddenly getting knocked back on promotion just wasn't so important anymore. And so we were able to transform the criteria for promotion. What we have seen since then is that education-focused staff are actually achieving at a higher rate of promotion than R&T staff, and some of that's dealing with a backlog of people who haven't been put through on the old criteria. But it just underscores the importance of listening to what is achievable and what's unachievable, and having expectations that are aligned with the opportunities that we can give someone. So that question, it goes back to what makes us special, and it was something that we reflected on quite a bit when we were looking at that, and I reflect on it frequently when I'm thinking about how do I advocate for and support staff who are more junior than me on this career track to achieve their ambitions for what they want to do. I think part of it is it's the classic thing of time. So we're not research driven in the same way. We don't have to produce referable submissions that are a minimum of 3-star outputs, blah, blah, blah. So I think we spend more time, but also more passion thinking about these questions, thinking about our students, thinking about our colleagues. And our real value added, I think, comes from the leadership that we do, not even necessarily in the classroom, but often outside the classroom. It's the mentoring and helping our colleagues who don't have time to work through all of these issues to achieve more, to improve their practice. I think it maps very elegantly to the Advanced HE Senior Fellow characteristics of the mentoring, leading, coordinating others. So it's not just, are we excellent in the classroom? Can we design a good educational experience? It's actually the stuff that happens outside of that. It's the time that we take on continuing professional development and helping people to implement changes in their own practice. And it's the research that we do about education and student experience. But that research doesn't necessarily look the way that it looks for someone who is looking for referable outputs. So this is just taken from a comparison of a few different universities' published criteria. I'm always a bit of a magpie with these. So when we reviewed ours, I went out and kind of gathered all of the universities who had clearly published criteria on their websites about what they expected from this career track. And I think it's the second point that's really important. So for R&T, we're expecting ref publications generally. No matter what institution you're in, you're going into the ref because you're in that census. And if you're not going into the ref, then your institution's probably having performance management style conversations. But on our slide, it's the scholarly outputs. And this is where in some institutions, they've been very forward-thinking and flexible, and in some, they're sticking very much with the ref light style interpretation of what scholarly outputs look like. So we've had discussions. Of course, there's the peer-reviewed publications. There is absolutely nothing wrong, and in fact, it's very impactful to make peer-reviewed publications about education and student experience-related themes. But I think something that generally gets neglected by the ref, whether or not it should is a different question, but generally is textbooks, which are an absolute beast to write, probably read by far more people than most of our peer-reviewed publications, really influential in developing the next generation of what that subject means. But it's also things like national committee reports and subject benchmark statements, things that actually change the way that we perceive and teach and project our disciplinary identity. But it's also open educational resources. It's that sharing and helping to bring educational attainment along internationally. And it's things like handbooks, which might only be produced internally, but might have a huge impact on the cohorts that we're producing them for, and other forms of staff and student resources. So at that end of things, we've lobbied quite hard within my institution to have them recognized because, for example, I co-edited a special issue of a journal entirely about assessment feedback on the back of my Advanced HE grant. And I think it's a cracking publication. I've done lots of talks about it. And I think the citations on that is about 30 over a decade. I've probably had more people in the room when I've delivered presentations than I've had citations of those papers. On the other hand, I built a digital learning intranet during COVID as digital learning director that within 2 years had hit, I think, 11,000 views and about 700 unique staff. And then we built a wider one for education and student experience when I came into my current role. And in the last 18 months, we're now north of 21,000 views and we're getting on for 1,000 staff. So that's what, like 1/8 of the staff of my university have accessed that at some point. So my argument would be that's probably had a higher impact on how people go about education than the piece of work that I'm actually really proud about of the peer-reviewed publications. But we need to take that into account when we're looking at what does it mean to be education focused, and it might not just mean journal articles. But I would also argue that we have a lot of different flavors of education focused careers. So sometimes when I've had conversations with people and they've looked at my career track and they've gone, I don't think I want to be a professor because I don't want to be you. Now, I enjoy curriculum. I'm very much on the kind of classic curriculum route. I really enjoy quality assurance. not everyone's cup of tea. I like marking criteria, I like benchmarking, I like comparison of standards, I like minimums and maximums. But for some people, that fills them with horror. And they actually love doing belonging and extracurricular events and working with student representatives and getting people to engage or supporting their welfare and their mental health and enabling them to get into the classroom and to cross those barriers to be able to engage with the staff that people like me who really like the curriculum stuff can produce. So I think we need to recognize that maybe more so than R&T, there is a real diversity of who we are, but sometimes we just need to be able to verbalize that more and to think about who am I? What is my contribution? I don't have to be good at everything. But I remember when I was working towards professor and people kept saying, well, but what are you going to be a professor of? And I was thinking, what is that thing that people are going to know you for? What are they going to associate you with? And developing that identity and contribution and not trying to do it all, but actually just getting a balance of different people who are good at admissions, people who are good at digital, people who are good at curriculum. If everybody liked QA like me, our students would be bored stiff because there would be no student society events, there would be no film club, there would be no visiting speakers. So it takes lots of different kinds to bring that diversity, the education-focused career. But in order to enable that, there's a lot of things that we need and that I don't think we're currently consistently providing. So having looked at some institutional criteria and now having been an external reviewer for a few different institutions for promotion applications, the clarity of the criteria is excellent in some institutions, absolutely opaque in other institutions, and really variable, much more so than R&T criteria. So R&T, sometimes there's some tweaks around the edges of, do you have to supervise a PhD student to completion? How much external grant income do you want? But the core of it is pretty consistent. I wouldn't say the same for this career track. Access to mentoring is variable. So I discovered in my faculty, which is around 11,000 students, about 850 staff, 7 different subject areas. There are now 3 of us who are professors on this career track. So there were no examples where I could just go and sit down with somebody and be mentored and understand how to advance my career. And I think sometimes that's a real frustration that people are running into of, who could I even look at? Who can I talk to? Who can I explain that with? It's about those leadership opportunities and highlighting to staff that it's not academic admin, it's academic leadership. You know, what you can actually make a really big contribution as an academic misconduct officer, but also helping the line managers who are assigning those roles to understand that much more so than R&T, unless you're going to be director of research or something, those leadership roles are integral to the career advancement. So it's not just leading a team of people on a module and delivering a good student experience. It's those other leadership opportunities we have to make sure that we're creating. But we also have a problem industry-wide about access to study leave and having parity of esteem. So we're willing often to internally fund study leave applications, or at least match fund them to a certain extent. But often if we have that conversation for education-focused staff, it's, oh, we can't pay for that. And it's thinking, well, maybe we need to reconceptualize study leave. It might not be something where you're doing it to go write a research publication, but it might be something where you need time out of the classroom in order to undertake a program of change that's going to have a huge impact across lots of students, but you simply can't do it when you're on the constant treadmill in the classroom. So it's thinking about how we can lobby for that and demonstrate the value added and demonstrate that we couldn't possibly do this without that bit of time, but that this is going to make a huge difference to things like student satisfaction, student belonging, engagement, things like that. And we need more community. So, you know, a lot of us are in the closet and we kind of whisper very quietly that we actually really enjoy the education focused side of things and we're not failed R&T. But I think there's a growing community, but it's still quite hard sometimes to find other people who are on that track. I think I'm going to stop my reflections there and just open up to a general conversation.
Thank you so much, Helen. Really, really interesting. I've really liked that perspective, that almost institutional perspective, that you looked at the promotion criteria and you worked on improving, updating, and making it more real and realistic for education focused. And thank you so much for including so many real data and statistics. I didn't know so many surprising facts, to be honest. Interesting. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording and we'll move on to questions.